The notice had been taped to the door of the motel room with a single strip of masking tape, which meant whoever left it had done so quickly, casually, the way you'd mark something that didn't warrant much ceremony. Diane Calloway stood in the hallway and read it twice. Then she folded it into her coat pocket and went back inside. Her daughter was still asleep. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to Marisol was 9 years old and slept the way children do when exhaustion wins completely, flat on her back with one arm thrown over her eyes, her breathing so even and deep it almost sounded like contentment. Diane watched her for a long moment. The room smelled of mildew and the particular staleness of air that had been recycled through cheap filters for too many years. The carpet was the color of old mustard. The heater clicked and groaned every 7 minutes, a sound Diane had stopped hearing 3 weeks ago. They had until Friday. The notice said 5 days, which was the legal minimum the motel was required to provide before they could change the lock and stack whatever you'd left behind in trash bags by the dumpster. Diane had seen it happen to other people. She had watched from the window of this room while a man she didn't know carried a child's bicycle out of a room 2 doors down and set it against the concrete wall like it was garbage. She had thought then that she would never let that happen to them. She still believed that. She just didn't know yet what believing it would require. She sat at the small table by the window and opened the envelope she'd been carrying in her purse for 11 days without opening. It was from the county tax office. She knew what it said because the woman at the desk, a tired woman named Patricia who had gone to high school with Diane's older sister, had explained it to her over the phone 3 weeks ago in the flat tone of someone delivering news they'd delivered many times before. The Caldwell Foundry on Breckenridge Road had gone to tax delinquency. The county had held it for 2 years waiting for someone to come forward. Nobody had. It was going to public auction in 12 days, and the starting bid had been set at $250 because the county assessor had looked at the property, looked at the aerial photographs, looked at the environmental history, and determined that the cost of remediation would likely exceed any value the land could generate. The $250 was a formality, a way of clearing the paperwork. Diane read the letter again. Then she looked at Marisol sleeping. She had $430 in checking. She had a prepaid cell phone with 11 days of service remaining. She had a 2003 Honda Civic that needed a new alternator and was currently surviving on borrowed time and a prayer that the battery would hold through cold starts. She had a box of Marisol's things in the trunk because when the last apartment had ended, there hadn't been room for everything and she had chosen her daughter's things over her own. She had a certificate in industrial maintenance from Garfield Community College, which she had completed 6 years ago while working nights at a bottling plant and raising a toddler alone after Marcus left. She had never used the certificate for anything except to tape it to the refrigerator of the apartment they'd had on Moreau Street, the one Marisol used to call the flower apartment because of the window box Diane had kept on the sill with marigolds until the landlord said window boxes were a lease violation and she'd had to take it down. $430. $250 for the foundry. She sat at that table until 4 in the morning, and when she got up she had made exactly one decision. The Caldwell Foundry stood at the end of Breckenridge Road where the road stopped pretending to go anywhere useful and simply ended in a chain-link fence that had been installed sometime in the 1990s and hadn't been properly maintained since. Diane drove past it twice before she turned around and parked on the gravel shoulder. Marisol was in the back seat eating crackers from a sleeve she'd been rationing for 2 days. "Mama, what is this place?" It was not a question exactly. It was the sound a child makes when they are looking at something that doesn't fit any category they've been given yet. Diane looked at the foundry through the windshield. The main structure was a long, low industrial building, maybe 200 feet end to end, the walls made of corrugated steel that had oxidized to the color of dried blood. The windows along the upper section had been boarded over with plywood that had since warped and split, and in some places had fallen away entirely to leave dark rectangular gaps that looked like missing teeth. Along the south side, a secondary building had partially collapsed inward, its roof bowing in the middle like a spine that had given up. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete apron that surrounded the building, some of them chest high, and the chain-link fence was threaded with dead vines that had knotted themselves so thoroughly into the metal that removing them would require cutting. There was a sign. She could see the ghost of letters, Caldwell Iron Works, EST 1911, but the paint had faded to near nothing, and someone had spray painted over part of it years ago. It looks scary, Marisol said. Diane opened the car door. Come on. She had driven out here because she needed to look at it with her own eyes before she made the decision final in her mind. She had looked up the property online the night before at the motel office, using the ancient desktop computer the front desk kept for guests, and what she'd found had not encouraged her. The foundry had operated continuously from 1911 through 1987, when it had closed under circumstances that the county environmental records described only as legacy contamination issues. The last owner of record had died in 2004 without heirs, and the property had changed hands twice after that through circumstances that the tax records didn't fully explain, before finally landing in county possession 2 years ago when the last holding company had dissolved. The contamination records were what most people would have stopped at. She had read them carefully. Lead and manganese in the soil around the poor floor, elevated arsenic levels near what appeared to have been a processing pond on the east side of the property, residual heavy metals consistent with decades of iron work. The environmental consultant the county had hired in 2019 had recommended against any residential development and had estimated remediation costs at somewhere between $800,000 and $2 million, depending on the extent of the contamination. None of that was what Diane was looking at. She was looking at the main structure, and she was thinking about what she knew about industrial construction from the 6 months she'd spent helping her Uncle Reggie with demolition work the summer she was 19, before community college, before Marcus, before any of it. She was thinking about the way structures from this era were built, the engineering principles that had governed industrial construction in the early 20th century, the way men who built things to last had poured those foundations. Marisol stood beside her at the fence, crackers still in hand, looking through the chain link. Mama, that lock. What about it? Marisol pointed to the gate, which was secured with a padlock that had been there long enough to have developed a rust patina on its surface. Feel it. Diane looked at her daughter. I touched it when you were walking over. It's warm. The lock is warm, like from the inside. Diane looked at the lock. She stepped up to the gate and pressed the back of her hand against the padlock. The metal was warm, not slightly warmer than ambient, the way metal sometimes is from sun exposure. Actually warm, noticeably warm, as if heat was emanating through the gate from somewhere beyond it. The air was 43 degrees. She stood there with her hand against that warm metal, and she thought about the heat. She thought about what lay below the concrete apron, about the geology of this particular stretch of Breckenridge Road, about the iron ore deposits that had made this location valuable enough to build a foundry on in 1911. She thought about a fact she had read in the environmental assessment, almost a footnote, almost nothing, a single line noting that a geological survey conducted in 1986 had identified a thermal anomaly in the subsurface consistent with geothermal activity, but that no further investigation had been conducted as the foundry was still operational at the time and the survey had been commissioned for other purposes. She pressed her hand flat against the gate. The auction was in 11 days. She had $430. The drive back to the motel took 22 minutes, and during those 22 minutes Diane did not speak, and Marisol, who had learned to read her mother's silences the way other children learn to read picture books, did not ask questions. When they got back to the room, Marisol brushed her teeth and got into bed, and Diane sat at the table again and wrote numbers on the back of the county tax envelope. $250 for the bid. $40 for registration fees, which she had confirmed by calling the county clerk's office that afternoon from the motel lobby phone. That left $140. $140 for food, for the Civic's gas tank, for the phone, for whatever came next. She thought about what came next for a long time. There was a woman named Greta Osei who had been 2 years ahead of Diane at Garfield Community College and who had gone on to do graduate work in geothermal engineering at a university in Oregon. Diane knew this because she had followed Greta's career in the vague background way you follow the lives of people you once sat next to in lecture halls, through occasional social media posts and the small currency of alumni newsletters. Greta had come back to this part of the state 4 years ago to work for an energy consulting firm. Diane had her email address from an alumni directory. She had never written to her. She opened the battered laptop she'd borrowed from the motel owner, a kind Bulgarian man named Vasil, who let her use it during the hours it wasn't needed for the front desk, and she composed an email. She deleted it twice and wrote it again. The final version was 4 sentences long. It explained who she was, noted that they had attended the same program though different years, and asked whether Greta would be willing to look at a geological survey report and give her a 20-minute phone call before next Thursday. She attached the 1986 geological survey, which she had found in the county records archive and downloaded as a PDF, and she hit send. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark listening to Marisol breathe and to the heater click and groan on its 7-minute cycle, and she thought about the lock that was warm when the air was 43 degrees. She thought about what it might mean and what it might cost and what it would take. She thought about the motel notice folded in her coat pocket and the $40 of registration fees and the $140 that stood between her and nothing. She thought about Marisol saying the lock is warm. The lock is burning hot, with the matter-of-fact certainty children have when they report the world as they find it, before anyone has taught them which observations are worth making and which are not. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. Greta Osei called at 7:45 the next morning. Diane was in the motel parking lot because Marisol was still sleeping and she didn't want to wake her. She stood in the cold with the phone pressed against her ear and her free hand shoved into her coat pocket, and she listened to a woman she barely knew explain what she was looking at. "I've seen this survey before," Greta said. "I mean, not this specific one, but this type." She paused. "Where did you say this property was?" Diane told her. Okay, I know this area. There's a formation running under that whole stretch of Breckenridge, a granitic intrusion with some unusual thermal characteristics. The survey they did in '86 was looking for soil contamination pathways, and they kind of stumbled onto it, and then didn't follow up because they didn't have a reason to." She paused again. "You said the gate lock was warm. Noticeably warm." "Yes." "In 43-degree air." "Yes." Greta was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking about doing with this property?" Diane told her. "Not everything. Not the motel notice or the $430 or Marisol rationing crackers in the back seat. Just the plan as she had formed it over the past 2 days, the outline of it, the shape." Greta listened without interrupting. When Diane finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be meaningful. "Diane," Greta said, "what you're describing, if the thermal gradient is what that survey suggests it might be." She stopped. "How soon is the auction?" 10 days. "I want to see the property. Can you give me access?" "It's county-owned. I can call the assessor's office." "Call them today. I can be there Thursday." Diane stood in the parking lot after the call ended and looked at the sky, which was low and gray and the color of old pewter. A pickup truck pulled out of the lot, and the driver nodded at her, and she nodded back, and then the truck was gone, and she was alone again with the cold and the sound of traffic on the road. She went inside and made instant coffee with the motel room kettle and sat at the table while Marisol slept, and she allowed herself, carefully, like a woman handling something fragile, to think about what Greta had not quite said but had come close to saying. She did not let herself think about it completely, because she had learned that complete thinking about possibilities before they were confirmed was a kind of emotional debt you couldn't always afford to repay when the possibilities failed. She let herself think about it in outline only, just the shape. Then she started making calls. The county assessor's office agreed to Thursday with less difficulty than she'd expected. The woman she spoke to, a clerk named Darnell who pronounced each word with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been burned before by being quoted incorrectly, confirmed that prospective bidders were entitled to access the property in advance of auction provided they signed a liability waiver and were accompanied by a county representative. He could meet them at 9. She called Vasil at the front desk and asked if she could extend through the weekend. Vasil said yes with the uncomplicated generosity he had shown since the first week they'd arrived, when he had seen Diane helping Marisol with homework at the lobby table because the room light wasn't bright enough, and had moved them to a room with better lighting without making anything of it. She did not tell Vasil what she was planning. She did not tell anyone. That evening Marisol asked why they were still at the motel, and Diane said they were waiting to see about a place. Marisol accepted this. She was a child who had learned to accept the provisional nature of arrangements, which was something Diane felt as a low constant ache, the knowledge that her daughter had been trained by circumstance to expect uncertainty as a baseline condition. "You'll tell me when we know something," Marisol said. "You'll be the first." Marisol went back to her book. She was reading a library copy of a novel about a girl who discovers a hidden door in a lighthouse, and she had renewed it twice already and was on her third reading because the library was free and the book was good, and there were not many things in her life that were both of those things simultaneously. Diane watched her read and thought about what she was going to do. Thursday came with fog that sat low and heavy over the road and did not lift by 9. Darnell from the assessor's office was already there when Diane arrived, a compact man in a county windbreaker who held a clipboard and looked at his watch when she pulled in. Greta arrived 4 minutes later in a gray pickup truck with a university parking permit still stuck to the windshield from what looked like several years ago. Greta was taller than Diane remembered from the handful of times they'd been in the same room at Garfield. She wore work boots and carried a bag that clanked when she set it down. She shook Diane's hand with a grip that communicated nothing except competence. Darnell unlocked the gate. The padlock was warm. Greta noticed immediately, crouching to look at it before she'd even stepped through, touching it with 2 fingers and then the back of her hand the way Marisol had. She looked at Diane. Diane said nothing. They walked the property for 2 hours. Darnell followed at a distance of 10 feet, making notes on his clipboard, occasionally answering questions about the site history in the flat professional voice of someone required to disclose but not required to interpret. Greta moved with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this kind of survey work before, pausing at intervals to take readings with instruments Diane didn't recognize, crouching to examine the ground, pressing her palm flat against the concrete in certain spots. At one point, near the south wall of the main building, Greta stopped and stood completely still for almost a full minute. Diane stood beside her and did not speak. "There's a sealed section," Greta said finally, without preamble, as if she were continuing a conversation that had been happening inside her head. Her voice was very even. "East side of the main pour floor. You can see where the wall was modified, probably in the 60s based on the mortar profile. Something was enclosed." Diane looked at the wall. She had noticed the seam too, the place where the brickwork changed character, where the spacing and the color of the mortar shifted. "The heat signature is different in there," Greta said. "The gradient suggests the thermal source is closer to the surface in that section, by about 30 meters. Darnell had come up behind them. Greta looked at him. "Is there any record of subsurface modifications to the eastern pour floor section?" Darnell consulted his clipboard. "There's a reference to a 1963 structural survey, but the survey itself isn't in the county file. It may be in the state industrial archives." Greta nodded. She took 3 more readings. Then she walked back outside and stood at the edge of the concrete apron and looked at the building for a long time. Diane waited. "You understand," Greta said, "that I can't tell you what's in there. Not without drilling. Not without a full geothermal assessment. I understand. And you understand that everything I'm about to tell you is speculative based on a survey done nearly 40 years ago and a thermal reading taken through concrete. I understand." Greta looked at her. The fog was starting to thin. Somewhere above them the sun was pressing against the gray. "The 1986 survey identified a formation that is, in my professional opinion, consistent with a high-gradient geothermal resource. The thermal anomaly we're seeing through that wall suggests proximity to that resource at a depth that would be, if the gradient holds, commercially significant." She paused. "The modification to that east section suggests that someone, sometime, went down there, which means there may be infrastructure already in place, or evidence of what's there, or both." Diane stood very still. Greta picked up her bag. "I'm not telling you to bid on this property. I'm telling you that if what I think is down there, the assessed value of this land is wrong by a number I am not qualified to give you. I'm also telling you that if the environmental contamination is as concentrated in the surface soil as these records suggest, and if the subsurface is clean, which geothermal sites often are, then the remediation picture may be significantly different from what the county is assuming." She looked at Diane directly. "Those are 2 very different conversations to have with 2 very different sets of people." Diane nodded. "You should bid." Diane nodded again. Greta shook her hand again and got in her truck and left. Darnell locked the gate and handed Diane a copy of the liability waiver and told her the auction registration deadline was the following Monday, and that payment of the winning bid would be required in full within 48 hours. Diane sat in the Civic in the parking lot for a while after they left. The fog had almost fully lifted. The foundry sat at the end of the road in the thin late-morning light, the corrugated walls the color of rust and old blood, the windows dark where they weren't boarded, the weeds standing still in air that had gone cold and clear. She thought about $250. She thought about the warm lock. She called her sister. Renata Calloway had lived in the same house in Clarksville for 11 years, a house she owned with her husband Thomas, a plumber, and their 3 children. Renata was 41. She and Diane had not spoken in 14 months, which was the length of time that had elapsed since a conversation at their mother's birthday dinner that had started with Renata saying she was worried about Diane and had ended with Diane leaving before the cake. Diane had not called in the months since, because calling would have required explaining why she hadn't called already, and explaining that would have required admitting things she had not been ready to admit. She was ready now. Renata picked up on the second ring. "I know," Diane said. "I know it's been too long. I know I should have called. I need to tell you some things, and then I need to ask you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." There was a pause. Then Renata said, "Okay." Diane talked for 35 minutes. She told Renata about the past 14 months, about the apartment on Moreau Street, and then the one on Halberd, and then the room at Vasil's motel. She told her about the alternator and the crackers and the library book Marisol had read 3 times. She told her about the motel notice folded in her coat pocket with 5 days on it. She told her about the foundry, about the geological survey, about the warm lock, about Greta and the 2-hour walk, and what Greta had said at the end. She told her about $250 and what she needed. When she finished, there was a silence. "I need to talk to Thomas," Renata said. Her voice was careful. Not closed, just careful. "I know. And I'm going to need the survey report. And this woman's contact information. I'll send them tonight." "Diane, why didn't you call before this?" Diane looked at the foundry through the windshield. "Because I thought I could fix it myself." The silence on the other end was not angry. It was something else. The sound of a person deciding how to be kind without being dishonest. "How's Mari?" "She's good. She's really good." "Does she know?" "She knows we're figuring things out." "Okay," Renata said. "Send me the documents. I'll call you tomorrow." Diane drove back to the motel. Marisol was at the small table doing homework, her library book open beside the math worksheet, as if they were in conversation. She looked up when Diane came in. "Well, we want to look at it." And Diane sat down. "I called Aunt Renata." Marisol's face did something complicated. She and Renata had not spoken in 14 months either, by extension, by proximity, by the accident of being Diane's daughter. She set down her pencil. "What did she say?" "She said she'd call tomorrow." Marisol looked at the math worksheet. Then she looked back up. "Mama, the lock." "Yeah, it was really warm." "I know, baby." Marisol picked up her pencil. "Okay," she said, and went back to the math. And Diane sat there watching her daughter work and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was not hope exactly, but was close enough to it that she could not clearly say what the difference was. Renata called the next morning at 7:15. "Thomas is in," she said. She did not say how much or what the terms were or what Thomas had said. She just said, "Thomas is in," which told Diane everything she needed to know about her brother-in-law, who she had always liked and who she now liked more than she had words for. The number they had agreed on was $3,000. Enough for the bid, the registration fees, the first round of necessary expenses, and a small reserve. Renata read off her bank account information and told Diane that the transfer would be in her account by the end of the day. "Diane," Renata said before hanging up, "this better be what you think it is." "I know. And we're coming for Christmas." Diane's throat went tight. "Yeah, okay. I want to see Mari. She wants to see you." There was a breath on the other end. 14 months is a long time. "I know. I'm sorry. I know you are. Go register for your auction." Diane went. The county auction office was on the 3rd floor of the municipal building downtown, a room with fluorescent lights and a counter staffed by 2 people who processed bidder registrations with the same tired professionalism as every other government office Diane had visited in her life. She filled out the forms. She paid the registration fee. The woman behind the counter handed her a bidder number and explained the auction procedures in a voice that had delivered those procedures many times and would deliver them many more. On her way out, she passed a man in a canvas jacket coming in the other direction, carrying a folder of documents. He was in his 60s with the look of someone who bought distressed properties for a living, someone who had done this enough times that the courthouse steps held no surprises. He glanced at her bidder number without meaning to, the reflexive awareness of competition, and she looked at his folder, and they both looked away and kept walking. She thought about him on the drive back. There would be others. There were always others at these auctions, the people who showed up because distressed properties were their business, who would look at the environmental record and run numbers and decide whether the remediation cost made the land worth acquiring for future development. Most of them would look at the Caldwell Foundry and decide the numbers didn't work. But not all of them. And the ones who thought they might work would bid. And when they bid, they would start low because the property was a liability by any conventional measure, and going high on a liability was how you lost money in this business. She had to not let them get it. She had $3,000. She thought about what Greta had not said, but had come close to saying. She thought about the sealed section behind the modified wall, about the thermal gradient, about 30 meters closer to the surface than it should have been. She thought about 1963 and why someone would have enclosed a section of their own poor floor and sealed it. She parked at the motel and sat in the car for a moment before going in. The sky had cleared. The afternoon light was thin and cold and very clear, the kind of light that made everything look both sharper and more fragile than it normally did. 5 days to the auction. Inside, Marisol was sitting on the bed with the library book open in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. She was looking at the door. Mama. Yeah, what's going to happen? Diane sat down on the bed beside her. She put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. Marisol leaned into her, the way she had since she was small, with the full weight of trust that children extend to the people they have decided to believe in. We're going to go to an auction, Diane said, and we're going to bid on that building. With what money? Aunt Renata sent some. And we have some. What if someone outbids us? Diane pulled her daughter a little closer. Then we figure out something else. Marisol was quiet for a moment. The heater clicked. Outside, a car passed on the road. But you don't think that's going to happen? I think, Diane said carefully, that lock was warm for a reason. And I think we were the ones who noticed it. And I think sometimes that's enough. Marisol considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Then she opened her book to where she'd left off and resumed reading. And Diane sat beside her in the thin afternoon light and did not move for a very long time. The morning of the auction, Diane woke at 4:30 and did not go back to sleep. She lay in the dark listening to Marisol breathe, and she thought about the past week, about every phone call and every form and every number she had written on the back of an envelope. She had prepared as much as preparation was possible. She had read every document available through the county records. She had talked to Greta twice more, brief calls in which Greta had been careful and precise and had said, each time, that she couldn't tell Diane what was down there, only what the evidence suggested, and that evidence was not certainty. She thought about what certainty would have cost. She got up and made coffee with the kettle and sat at the table while the room was still dark and Marisol was still sleeping, and she thought about her mother, who had died 3 years ago in the hospital in Clarksville with Renata at her side, because Diane had been working a double shift and had not gotten there in time. Her mother had been a woman who worked with her hands, a woman who had spent 40 years doing alterations and repairs at a dry cleaner's on Fletcher Street, who had known every seam and every fabric by touch, who could look at a piece of clothing and tell you how it had been made and what it had cost and whether it would last. She had told Diane once, when Diane was maybe 12, that the things worth having were always the things other people had given up on, because the giving up was the proof that the thing was hard, and the hard things were the ones that mattered. Diane thought about the foundry at the end of Breckenridge Road. The corrugated walls the color of dried blood. The weeds through the concrete. The dark windows and the collapsed secondary building and the environmental record that had made the county set the opening bid at $250 because they had looked at it and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. The warm lock. She woke Marisol at 7. They ate crackers and the last of the peanut butter and drove downtown in the clear, cold morning and parked 2 blocks from the municipal building because the nearby lot cost $4 and she needed the $4. The auction was in the same room where she had registered, but with folding chairs set up and a lectern at the front and a county official named Harold who had the bearing of someone who had presided over many such proceedings and found them neither exciting nor tedious, but simply necessary. There were 11 other bidders. Diane counted them while she was finding her seat. The man in the canvas jacket from the other day was there. There were 2 others who had the same professional look, folders and clipboards, and the settled patience of people who did this regularly. The rest were harder to read. Harold opened the proceedings at 9 on the dot with the brisk efficiency of a man who had other things on his schedule. He reviewed the terms. He described the property. He read the environmental summary in full, which took 4 minutes, and which caused... Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Caused 2 of the bidders to exchange a look and one of them to quietly close his folder and cap his pen. Opening bid, Harold said, $250. Diane raised her paddle. $250. The man in the canvas jacket raised his. $300. $400, said one of the other professional bidders, a woman with gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. $5, Diane said. $6, said the canvas jacket. $750, said the woman with the reading glasses. $1,000, Diane said. The canvas jacket hesitated. The woman with the reading glasses looked at Diane with an expression that was not quite curiosity and not quite assessment, but something between the two. $1,200, said the canvas jacket. $15, Diane said. The canvas jacket looked at his folder. The woman with the reading glasses did not move. Around them, the other bidders were still and attentive in the way of people who have decided they are watching something rather than participating in it. $1,800, said the canvas jacket. $2,200, Diane said. Harold looked between them with the equanimity of a man watching a tennis match he had no stake in. The canvas jacket looked at his folder again. He looked at Diane. She met his eyes and did not look away. She was thinking about the 1986 Geological Survey and the 1963 Structural Modification and the thermal gradient and the sealed section behind the modified east wall. She was thinking about Greta saying the assessed value of this land is wrong by a number I am not qualified to give you. The canvas jacket set his paddle down. The woman with the reading glasses did not move. $2,200 going once, Harold said. $2,200 going twice. He looked around the room. No one moved. Sold. Diane set her paddle down. Her hands were not shaking. She had thought they might be, but they were not. She sat in the folding chair in the fluorescent light of the county auction room, and she breathed in and out twice, slowly. And then she stood and walked to the front of the room to sign the paperwork. The woman with the reading glasses caught her eye as she passed. There was something in her expression that might, under other circumstances, have been called respect. Diane nodded slightly. The woman nodded back. Harold processed the paperwork with the same brisk efficiency he brought to everything. The county deed, the liability transfer, the acknowledgement of existing environmental conditions. She signed 11 documents and wrote a check from the account where Renata's transfer had landed, and Harold stamped each form with the methodical satisfaction of a man who loves stamps, and she walked out of the municipal building into the cold, clear morning with a manila envelope under her arm and the deed to the Caldwell Foundry in her name. She sat in the Civic for a moment. Then she called Renata. Renata picked up on the first ring. We got it. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Renata said, okay, and Diane could hear something in her voice that was not disbelief and not surprise, but was close to both. The sound of a woman recalibrating. Okay, Renata said again. What now? Now we go look. Today. Marisol is with me. I want her to see it. Diane. I know. She's 9. I know. But she noticed the lock. She should be there. Another silence. Then, more quietly, be careful. Always. She picked Marisol up from the motel, where Vasil had been watching her with the relaxed attentiveness he brought to most things, and she drove to Breckenridge Road and parked at the end of it, and they walked to the gate together. The padlock was warm. She had the key now, a large old iron key that the county clerk had handed her along with the deed, and she put it in the lock and turned it, and the gate swung open on hinges that had been still for a very long time. Marisol stood at her shoulder. "It's ours now," Diane said. Marisol looked at the building, at the weeds and the rust and the dark windows and the collapsed secondary structure and the concrete apron cracked and heaved by years of freeze and thaw. She looked at the padlock in her mother's hand. "Can I hold it?" Diane handed it to her. Marisol held it in both palms. The warmth of it was visible in the way she held it, not clenching but cradling, the way you hold something you want to understand. "Still warm," Marisol said. "Still warm," Diane agreed. They walked through the gate together onto the concrete apron and toward the building, and the fog that had been sitting in the lower places along the road was starting to lift, burning off in thin strips as the morning sun came up over the tree line. And the foundry sat there at the end of the road, as it had sat for 100 years, patient and rusted and apparently without value, waiting to be understood. The main door to the building was a rolling steel door of the type used in industrial structures built before loading docks became standard, wide enough to admit a truck, secured with a second lock that matched the padlock on the gate. The county had given her 2 keys. She used the second one now, and the lock opened with more resistance than the first, the internal mechanism gritty with disuse, but it opened. She did not go in yet. She stood at the edge of the opening and looked at what the dark interior showed her. A long space, the ceiling high enough that the upper reaches were in shadow. Light came through the gaps in the boarded windows and thin diagonal bars, catching dust motes that had been undisturbed for years and were now, for the first time in a long time, moving. The floor was concrete, dark with the absorbed residue of decades of metalwork, scored and stained in patterns that recorded the work that had happened here. Large fixtures along the floor, depressions and channels, and the mounting points of equipment long since removed or collapsed in place. The air was heavy and mineral and old. And warm. It was noticeably warmer inside than out. Not dramatically so, not the heat of a furnace, but the sustained, gentle warmth of a space that had something keeping it from going cold. Marisol pressed up beside her. "It's warm in there too." "Yes." Diane stepped inside. Her boots on the concrete made a sound that the space absorbed and returned at once, the acoustic of a large enclosed room with hard surfaces. She walked to the center of the main floor and turned slowly, taking in the full arc of it. The east wall was ahead of her and to the right. She could see it clearly now, in the angled light from the uncovered windows. The modification Greta had identified was obvious once you knew to look for it, the way hidden things often become obvious the moment you know they exist. The original wall was brick, late 19th or early 20th century construction, a particular pattern of laying that bricklayers of that era used in industrial buildings. At the east end, approximately 30 feet of wall had been reconstructed, the new bricks slightly smaller, the mortar a different color, the pattern of the laying slightly different. The seam where old met new was visible as a vertical line running from floor to ceiling. The wall that had replaced the original was not hollow. She pressed her palm against it in several places. Solid. Whatever the modification had enclosed was behind this wall, and the wall had been built to stay. She walked the length of it. Near the midpoint, she found something she had not seen in the photographs. A steel door, flush with the wall, its surface painted over many times until the original color was buried under layers of accumulated gray, its handle a steel lever of the industrial type, the kind that did not lock with a standard key, but with a proprietary mechanism. The door had no lock she could see, only the lever handle and a place where a lock had been, a rectangular recess in the door frame where the mechanism had been removed at some point and the void left empty. She pressed down on the lever. The door did not open. It moved. A slight give, a millimeter or two of travel, before stopping hard. Something was blocking it from the other side. Not a lock, a physical obstruction, weight or debris or something that had shifted against the door over years of disuse. She pressed harder. Nothing. She stepped back and looked at the door for a long time. Marisol appeared at her shoulder. "What's behind there?" "I don't know yet. But something is. Something is." Marisol looked at the door. Then she looked at the warmth she could feel on her face, the way you can feel warmth on your face before you can fully identify its source. She put her hand flat against the steel surface of the door. Her expression changed. "This is warmer than the wall." Diane put her own hand against the door. Marisol was right. The steel was conducting heat from behind it. Not extreme heat, not the heat of machinery or fire, but the steady measured warmth of something geologically patient, something that had been there long before the foundry had been built over it, and would be there long after the last brick crumbled. They stood there for a while in the tilted morning light of that old building, mother and daughter with their palms flat against a steel door that had been sealed for reasons Diane did not yet understand, feeling the heat come through. On the drive back to the motel, Marisol was quiet until they were almost there. Then she said, "Mama, what do we do now?" Diane said, "We call Greta." "And then what?" "Then we open the door." "How?" "Carefully," Diane said. "Very carefully." She called Greta from the motel room that afternoon, while Marisol did homework at the table. She described the steel door, the lever handle, the rectangular void where the lock mechanism had been, the way the door moved a millimeter or two before stopping against internal resistance. Greta listened. Then she said, "Do not force that door." "I wasn't planning to." "Good. Whatever is in there has been sealed for 60 years. The pressure differential alone, the thermal differential, you need to know what you're opening before you open it." She paused. "You need an engineering assessment. Full structural, geothermal, materials. I know people. This is what I do." "How long would it take?" Greta considered. "Best case, 2 weeks to mobilize the right team. This time of year, maybe 3. 3 weeks. Diane thought about the motel notice. She thought about what 3 weeks meant in terms of the money Renata had sent. The deed was in her name, but the motel was still by the week, and the alternator was still borrowed time, and Marisol still needed to eat. "I can cover the assessment cost if that's the issue," Greta said, reading something in the silence. "Against a stake in the findings. You can repay me when there's something to repay with, or not at all if I'm wrong about what's down there." Diane did not say anything for a moment. "I've been wrong before," Greta said. "And if I'm right, the value here is not something either of us should be navigating alone. You need the assessment. You need it documented before anyone else starts asking questions. And someone is going to start asking questions. What do you mean? You bought a piece of industrial real estate that the county couldn't give away. You paid more than the opening bid for a property with a documented environmental liability. In a county where everyone knows each other's business." Greta paused. "Someone is going to want to know why." Diane looked at the ceiling. She knew Greta was right. "How soon can you get the team out there?" "I'll make calls tonight." "Okay." "Diane." "Yeah, you did the right thing buying it. Whatever else happens." Diane sat for a moment after the call ended, phone still in hand. Outside the window, the afternoon light was going orange and thin. A car went past on the road. The heater began its 7-minute cycle. She looked at the county deed in the manila envelope on the table. Marisol looked up from her homework. "Well, we wait for Greta's team." "How long?" 2 or 3 weeks. Marisol looked back at her worksheet. Then she said, "Are we going to be okay while we wait?" Diane looked at her daughter. She thought about $430 in Renata's transfer and the check she'd written that morning. She thought about the alternator. She thought about the crackers and the peanut butter and the library book read 3 times. "We're going to be more than okay." Marisol wrote something on her worksheet. She did not look up again. "I believe you," she said. Diane sat in the orange late afternoon light of the motel room with the deed in the envelope on the table and the phone in her hand and her daughter doing homework beside her, and she thought about the warm lock and the sealed door and what Greta had not been willing to say out loud, but had come as close to saying as a careful scientist could come. She thought about the foundry at the end of Breckenridge Road, the 100 years of it, the men who had worked it and the iron that had poured through it and the decision someone had made in 1963 to seal off a section of the poor floor and build a new wall over it and leave a door with no lock, as if they wanted to be sure they could come back, but weren't ready to advertise what was there. She thought about what Greta had said the first day at the fence. "If what I think is down there, the assessed value of this land is wrong by a number I am not qualified to give you." Outside the window, the last of the afternoon light was going. The street lamp at the edge of the motel lot came on. The heater clicked. Marisol closed her homework folder and stood up and stretched and looked at her mother with the clear, direct gaze she had always had, the one that cut through everything you were holding back and went straight to what was real. "The lock was warm, Mama." "I know, baby. That means something." "I know." Marisol nodded once, satisfied, the way she nodded when a thing had been confirmed that she had already decided was true. Then she picked up her library book and went to the bed and opened it to the page with the girl and the lighthouse door and began to read. And Diane sat at the table in the light of the single lamp and did not move for a long time. And outside in the cold, clear night, the road ran on in both directions into the dark. Greta's team arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after the auction, in 2 trucks that were not the kind of trucks you saw in parking lots outside grocery stores or hardware stores. They were the kind that carried equipment, that sat low on their axles from the weight of what was inside them. And they pulled up to the gate at Breckenridge Road with a precision that suggested the people driving them had done this kind of arrival many times before. There were 4 of them besides Greta. A structural engineer named Paul Bremer, who was somewhere in his 50s and wore a hard hat clipped to his belt the way other men wore keys, ready but not yet needed. A geologist named Sandra who spoke very little and moved through spaces the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance and then going deeper. A man named Curtis who handled the instruments, a collection of devices on wheeled carts that Diane could not have named and whose purposes she could only partially infer. And a younger woman named Tomas who was apparently there to document everything, moving with a camera and a tablet, recording continuously without commentary. Diane stood at the gate and watched them unload. Marisol was in school. This was a decision Diane had made that morning after a conversation the night before in which Marisol had argued, with the focused logic of a 9-year-old who has thought something through carefully, that she should be there because she had found the warm lock first and therefore had a right to see what happened next. Diane had listened to the full argument and then said no, because school mattered more than being present at an engineering assessment. And Marisol had accepted this with the particular compressed disappointment of a child who knows the argument is over but wants to register that she disagrees. You'll tell me everything. Everything. Marisol had gone to school. Now Diane walked the team through the main building, showing them what she'd shown Greta 2 weeks earlier, the modified east wall, the seam, the steel door flush with the brick surface. Paul walked the wall with his hand against it, pressing at intervals, his face doing the focused, neutral thing of someone processing information. Sandra crouched at the base of the wall where the brick met the floor and examined the joint with a small light. Curtis began setting up instruments near the center of the main floor, placing sensors at measured intervals, moving with a methodical patience that communicated he was in no hurry because hurrying produced errors, and errors were expensive. Greta stood beside Diane at the steel door. It moved a fraction when I pressed the lever, Diane said. Something blocking it from inside. Greta pressed the lever herself. The same fraction of give, the same hard stop. She pressed her palm flat against the door surface, then against the wall surface on either side of it, comparing. She looked at Diane without speaking. Her expression said something that her professional caution would not allow her to say out loud. They worked for 6 hours. Curtis's instruments took continuous readings, and he moved them periodically, walking a grid he had marked on the floor with chalk lines. Paul examined every structural element of the east wall, photographing the brickwork and the seam in the doorframe and the header above the door with the systematic thoroughness of someone building a case rather than just documenting a building. Sandra spent a long time at the wall's base and then went outside to examine the exterior foundation line. Walking it with her small light and a probe, she worked into the soil at intervals. At one point in the early afternoon, Sandra came back inside and spoke quietly to Greta. Diane was close enough to hear only fragments. Gradient. Earlier than the model. Closer to 12. Greta looked at her. Asked a question in a voice too low for Diane to catch. Sandra nodded. Greta turned and found Diane across the space of the main floor and held her gaze for a moment. Then she walked over. We need to open the door. Diane looked at it. How? Paul says the obstruction is most likely debris or settled material against the inside face. The door opens inward, or we'd see exterior evidence of a seal. If we drill 2 anchor points in the doorframe and run a cable, we can apply controlled tension from outside without forcing the mechanism. Would that damage whatever is in there? Greta measured her words. The door opening won't damage anything. What's on the other side, we don't know yet. We proceed slowly, and we stop the moment we have visual confirmation of what we're looking at. Diane thought about it. She thought about 60 years of a door staying closed. She thought about the person or people who had built the wall and set the door and walked away. Okay, she said. Paul did the drilling with a tool from his kit that was quieter than she expected, boring 2 points into the doorframe with the careful, controlled aggression of someone who respects what he's working on. Curtis rigged the cable. They ran it to a hand winch that Paul anchored to a structural column 20 feet away, the angle calculated to pull the door straight along its axis rather than torque it. Everyone stepped back. Paul took the winch handle. He applied tension slowly. The cable went taut. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then a sound. Low. A grinding of something shifting against concrete. Something that had been still for decades being asked to move again. The door trembled in its frame. More tension. The grinding deepened. The door moved. Not all the way. An inch, then two, then a gap wide enough to see that behind it was not the dark of an empty space, but something else. Light. Not artificial light, not a lamp or a bulb, but the faint undirected luminescence of reflected heat, the way air looks above asphalt in summer, visible only because your eyes adjust. And warmth. Real warmth. Not the gentle ambient warmth of the main floor, but something more sustained, moving through the gap with the patient insistence of something that had been building pressure for a long time. Sandra was beside her, tablet raised, recording. Her voice was very quiet. Temperature differential at the opening is approximately 18 degrees above ambient. Paul applied more tension. The door ground open another 3 inches, then 4, then stopped again. Something still catching at the base where the debris had shifted rather than cleared. Enough, Greta said. Paul released the tension. Greta took a small flashlight from her jacket and put it through the gap. Diane stepped up beside her, and they both looked. The flashlight beam showed them the beginning of a descent. Stone steps, cut stone, going down at an angle steeper than a conventional staircase. The walls on either side of the steps were not brick. They were the native rock, the granitic formation that underlay the whole stretch of Breckenridge Road. And the walls were smooth in a way that did not suggest natural formation, but something worked, something shaped. The steps themselves were the same stone, each one cut with a precision that suggested either considerable skill or considerable time, or both. The beam reached as far as a landing, maybe 15 steps down, where the passage turned and the light could not follow. The air coming up from below was warm and dry and carried a smell that Diane could not name immediately. It was mineral and deep, the smell of stone that had never been. Cold, and under it something else, something she associated in some incomplete way with old metal and old time. Sandra was recording everything. Curtis had a sensor on a pole and was holding it through the gap, reading whatever it was reading, his face neutral and focused. Greta pulled the flashlight back and turned to Diane. "You need to understand something," she said. Her voice had gone very careful, the way voices go when the person speaking them is working to stay inside what they know and not step into what they don't. This passage did not exist on any survey or structural drawing in the county record. The county assessed this property on the basis of surface and near-surface conditions. Whatever is down, there was not part of any assessment that has ever been conducted of this property. Diane looked at the gap in the door, at the slice of ancient steps going down. She asked the question she had been building toward for 2 weeks. "How far does it go?" Greta looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at her tablet. Based on the thermal gradient and the depth model, Sandra said, the passage likely descends to a chamber or series of chambers at a depth consistent with the primary geothermal resource. She paused. That depth is approximately 40 meters below current surface grade. 40 meters. The number was not abstract to Diane. She had enough industrial training to translate it immediately into a physical reality, into what 40 meters of cut stone meant in terms of the labor and the planning and the purpose of the people who had made it. "Who built this?" she said. Greta shook her head. "Not my field." Paul had come up beside them. He was looking at the door frame, at the door's construction, at the hinges, which were not standard residential hinges, but something industrial and heavy, the kind specified for vaults. He touched one of the hinges with 2 fingers. "This hardware," he said. "This is not 1963 construction." He looked at Diane. "This door is older than the wall that was built around it." "How much older?" He shook his head. "I'd need a metallurgist." "But the alloy characteristics, the fabrication method." He looked at Greta. "This was here before the foundry." The sentence landed in the space between them, and nobody spoke for a moment. Before the foundry was 1911. Before 1911 was everything that the land had been before a family named Caldwell had decided it was a good place to make iron. Diane stood at the gap in the door with the warm air coming up from below and thought about 1911 and what had been here before it, and who had cut those steps, and why they had cut them here, and what they had put at the bottom. She thought about the 1963 structural modification, about someone who had worked in this building for decades and had found something and decided to enclose it rather than reveal it, to mark it with a door that had no lock, to leave it for someone who would understand what they were looking at. She looked at Greta. "We need to go down." "Not today." Greta's voice was firm but not unkind. "We need proper equipment. Lighting, air quality testing, structural assessment of the passage. We don't know the condition of those steps or the integrity of the walls. We don't know what the air composition is at depth." She looked at the gap. "We do this right, or we don't do it at all." Diane understood. She understood it in her body, in the patient practical part of her that had spent years doing maintenance work in industrial environments and knew that impatience around unknown structures was how people got hurt. "How long?" "A week," Greta said. "Maybe 10 days. I need to get proper spelunking equipment, a structural light rig, air quality monitoring. And I want to bring one more person. A historian. Someone who can look at this passage and tell us what we're looking at before we disturb it." Diane nodded. They spent another 2 hours on the surface, Curtis collecting his final readings, Paul completing his documentation, Sandra finishing her exterior survey. When they finally packed their equipment into the trucks and Greta came to stand beside Diane at the gate, the afternoon light had gone long and the shadow of the foundry building stretched across the concrete apron almost to the fence. Greta looked at Diane and did not perform any expression. She just looked. "I've been doing this work for 16 years, she said. "I have seen geothermal sites on 3 continents. I have consulted on projects that cost more money than most people see in 100 lifetimes." She paused. "I have never seen anything like what the readings show under this building." Diane did not ask her to elaborate. She understood that Greta had already said more than her caution usually allowed. They drove away. Diane stood at the gate until the sound of the trucks had faded down Breckenridge Road, and then she stood there a while longer in the quiet. Then she took out her phone and called Marisol. School would be out in 20 minutes. Vasil's wife, a woman named Eleni who had taken a quiet liking to Marisol and who sometimes let her sit behind the front desk and help sort the mail, was picking her up today. Marisol answered on the second ring with the particular alertness of a child who has been waiting all day for a phone call. Well, they opened the door a little. Enough to see inside. "What's inside?" "Stone steps going down." Diane paused, aware of how thin this information was against the weight of what the instruments had shown and what Greta had nearly said. "Very old steps. Cut from the rock itself." "How far do they go?" "We don't know yet. They need proper equipment. It'll be another week before we can go down." "A week." "I know." Silence on the other end. Diane could hear the ambient noise of the school hallway in the background, doors and voices, and the compressed energy of a building about to release 300 children into the afternoon. "Mama." "Yeah, those steps. Are they warm too?" Diane thought about the air coming up through the gap, the heat of it, the dry mineral smell. "The whole passage is warm," she said. "The whole way down." Marisol made a sound that was not quite a word. Then she said, "Okay," and hung up, because someone had called her name, and she was 9, and she had been patient enough for one day. Diane stood at the gate a while longer, and then she drove back to the motel. The week that followed was the strangest week of her life, and she had lived through some strange weeks. She went to the foundry every day, not because there was anything she could do there, not because the team was on site, but because it was hers and being there helped her think, and because standing in that building with the warmth coming up through the gap in the steel door made the whole thing feel real in a way that thinking about it in the motel room did not. She brought a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, and she sat in the main pour floor in the tilted light from the gap windows, and she thought about what came next. She had started making calls. The first was to a woman named Beverly Hart who had been Diane's supervisor at the bottling plant 8 years ago, and who had since moved into management at a regional industrial development company. Beverly was a practical woman with a strong memory for people who worked hard and a stronger memory for people who didn't. She had always liked Diane. She answered the call on the third ring with the warmth of someone genuinely surprised and pleased to hear from a person they'd thought was gone. They talked for 40 minutes. Diane told her about the foundry in the same careful way she had told Renata, giving her enough to understand the situation without giving her more than she'd earned yet by the terms of their current relationship. Beverly listened, asked precise questions, and at the end said she would make some calls of her own. What kind of calls? Diane asked. The kind you'll want to have been made when the time comes. The second call was to a man named Robert Lees who had been in the industrial maintenance program at Garfield Community College the same year as Diane. Not a friend exactly, but someone she had trusted in the way you trust people who work beside you without complaint. Robert now ran a small environmental remediation company in the county, 3 trucks and a crew of 8, the kind of operation that won contracts on county cleanup projects and did them without drama. She had looked him up the day after the auction and found that his company had a clean record and a reputation for straightforward work. She explained the environmental situation at the foundry, the legacy contamination in the surface soil, the subsurface clean zone that the geothermal geology appeared to indicate. She asked whether he would be willing to walk the property and give her a preliminary opinion on what remediation would actually require versus what the county had estimated. Robert said yes without hesitation and came out the following Tuesday. He walked the property in the methodical way of someone who has spent years learning to read ground for what it holds and what it's given up. He took soil samples from 6 locations. He looked at the environmental records she had printed from the county file. He stood for a long time at the east corner of the building where the contamination readings from the original survey had been highest. On the drive back to the road, he told her that the county's estimate of $800,000 to $2 million was based on worst-case assumptions about the lateral spread of the contamination and on remediation methods that were standard in 2019 but had since been superseded by newer approaches that cost significantly less and took significantly less time. How much less? Diane asked. He turned his hat in his hands. If the contamination is as concentrated as it looks rather than as spread as they feared, and if we use bioremediation rather than excavation for the organic components, you're looking at 300,000 to 400,000. Maybe less if the geology cooperates. Diane thought about what Greta had said. The assessed value of this land is wrong by a number I am not qualified to give you. Would you be willing to put that in writing? She asked. Robert looked at her. He had the expression of a man trying to decide whether to ask the question he was thinking. He decided against it. I'll have a preliminary estimate to you by Thursday, he said. The historian Greta brought was a woman named Dr. Eleanor Marsh who taught at a university 3 hours away and who specialized, as far as Diane could determine from the brief biography Greta sent her, in the material history of industrial and pre-industrial land use in the upper Midwest. She arrived on a Wednesday morning in a small car packed with books and equipment cases and a thermos larger than Diane's, and she shook Diane's hand with the brisk, preoccupied manner of someone whose mind was already in the building. She spent 4 hours examining the passage through the gap in the door before she said anything that Diane could call a conclusion. She studied the stonework with a loupe and a light. She took scrapings and samples. She photographed every visible surface. She made notes in a small book with a mechanical pencil, writing in a hand so small and compressed that it looked, from where Diane stood, like a language she had invented for herself. Finally, she straightened up from where she had been crouching at the gap and turned around. These steps, she said, were not cut in 1963. They were not cut in 1911. She looked at Diane with the patient intensity of someone about to say something unusual and wanting to be sure they are heard correctly. The tool marks on the stone, the style of the cutting, the specific profile of the risers. She paused. This passage was constructed in the mid to late 19th century, almost certainly before 1880. Diane looked at the gap. By whom? She asked. Dr. Marsh looked back at the gap. There were men who worked these formations in the second half of the 19th century, she said. Men who knew what was underground here the way farmers knew topsoil, from generations of working it and learning it. She was choosing words with great care. This area was not uninhabited before the Caldwell Foundry. There were operations here. Smaller, older, mostly unrecorded in the formal sense because the people who ran them had reasons not to put things in writing. What kind of operations? Dr. Marsh looked at her steadily. The kind that moved things, stored things, protected things that needed protecting during periods when the state of the world made protection necessary. Diane stood in the warm air of the main floor and thought about the second half of the 19th century and what had needed protecting during that period in this part of the country and what the people who protected it might have stored in a passage cut from living rock 40 meters below the surface of a piece of land that no one else had thought was worth anything. She thought about the warmth coming up from below. She thought about the environmental report that had described the thermal anomaly as a footnote and moved on. She thought about 1963 and the man or woman who had worked in this foundry for years and had found the door and gone down those steps and seen what was there and come back up and built a wall around it and walked away, who had not told anyone, who had kept the secret for the rest of their life, for reasons Diane might spend a long time understanding. "When can we go down?" she said. Greta answered from behind her. "Tomorrow. Equipment arrived this morning." Diane turned. Greta and Paul and Curtis were in the doorway, their second trucks visible through the gap behind them. The kind of equipment Diane now recognized as caving gear, portable lighting rigs, air monitoring stations, the structured rigging necessary to descend an unknown passage safely. "Tomorrow," Diane said. "Tomorrow." She drove to the school at 3:15 and was standing at the pickup line when Marisol came out. Marisol saw her face from 20 feet away and broke into a run. "Tomorrow," Diane said, before her daughter could ask. Marisol stopped in front of her, breathing hard from the run, backpack swinging. She looked at her mother's face. "Can I come? You can be there. You stay at the surface." Marisol processed this. "That means the gate. That means the main floor of the building. You can stand at the door, but you stay at the surface." "Okay." They drove back to the motel. That night Marisol was too restless to sleep before 10 and Diane was too restless to sleep before midnight, and the heater ran through its 7-minute cycles, and the night was very cold and very clear outside the window. The team assembled at the gate at 7 the next morning. Marisol stood beside Diane and did not speak, which was unusual enough that Paul noticed and crouched down to her level and said, "You found this place?" And Marisol said, "I found the warm lock," and Paul said, "That's not a small thing." And Marisol looked at him with the calm directness she brought to most adults and said, "I know." They widened the door gap first, Paul working the winch again with the careful incremental tension of the day before, clearing the remaining debris from the door's base until it swung free on its heavy hinges, opening onto the cut stone landing and the steps going down. The air that came through was the same sustained warmth, the same mineral depth, and in the full opening it was more pronounced than it had been through the gap, a real heat, real and geological and old. Curtis ran the air quality station first, standing at the top of the steps with sensors on poles, monitoring for anything that would make the descent unsafe. Carbon dioxide, methane, oxygen levels. He worked for 30 minutes, checking and rechecking, before he looked at Greta and nodded. "Clean," he said. "Better than ambient in most respects." Greta looked at Diane. "I want you to be the first one down," she said. "It's your property. You should see it first." Diane looked at the steps. She looked back at Marisol, who was standing at the doorframe, one hand on the brick, looking down into the lit passage with an expression Diane would remember for the rest of her life. "You stay here," Diane said. "I know." Diane put on the hard hat and the headlamp that Paul handed her, and she stepped through the door and began to descend. The steps were solid. Whatever century had cut them, they had been cut to last, and they had lasted. Diane went down carefully, testing each step before she weighted it, but every one held firm under her boot. The walls of the passage were close on either side, close enough that she could touch both simultaneously if she spread her arms, but the ceiling was high enough to walk upright without stooping. The headlamp lit the stone in front of her in a white circle that moved as she moved, and around the edges of the light the walls showed her things she could not stop to look at yet, marks and symbols cut into the stone at intervals, old marks, deliberate marks, the kind that people make when they want the passage to be readable to the people who come after them. The temperature rose as she descended. Not dramatically, not the heat of a furnace, but the steady measured increase of something real, something that had been building for a very long time under the surface of this particular piece of ground. She reached the landing that the flashlight beam had found 5 days before, where the passage turned. She turned with it. The passage continued another 20 steps, and then opened. She stood at the threshold of the opening for a long moment before she stepped through. The chamber was large, much larger than the passage had suggested it would be. The ceiling vaulted above her in a natural arch of the granitic stone, the arch reinforced in places with fitted stone that matched the passage walls, the work of the same hands that had cut the steps. The floor was level, dressed stone, the same stone as the walls, swept clean by no agency, she could identify except perhaps the dry, still air that had moved through this space unchanged for generations. The warmth was pronounced here. She could feel it through the soles of her boots, coming up from the stone itself, the geothermal energy that had made Greta speak in careful words about numbers she was not qualified to give. And in the chamber, arranged along the walls and down its center in an order that suggested not carelessness but system, not urgency but planning, were the things that someone had carried down those steps and placed here and sealed behind a door with no lock, so that they could come back, so that whoever came after them could come back, so that nothing would be lost. Diane stood in the doorway of the chamber, and her headlamp swept slowly across what was in front of her, and she did not move for a very long time. She was thinking about her mother's voice. The things worth having are always the things other people gave up on, because the giving up is the proof that the thing was hard, and the hard things are the ones that mattered. She was thinking about a 9-year-old girl's hand pressed against a warm padlock in 43-degree air, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone reporting the world exactly as it is. She was thinking about $250 and everything it had bought. From somewhere above her, faint but clear, she could hear Marisol calling her name. She turned and went back up. Marisol was at the top of the steps, both hands on the doorframe, leaning as far into the passage as she could without stepping onto the landing. Her face in the morning light was bright with the particular intensity she brought to things she cared about. "Mama." Diane came through the door. Her face must have shown something, because Greta, who was standing 3 feet away, went very still. "What is it?" Greta said. Diane looked at her daughter. She looked at Greta. She looked at Paul and Curtis and Sandra and Dr. Marsh, who were all watching her with the particular attention of people who have been waiting for a report. She thought about how to say what she had seen. She thought about what words were adequate to it. She thought about the chamber and what was in it and the system of its arrangement and the age of the things she had looked at and the warmth under her boots that Greta had called a resource worth numbers she wasn't qualified to give. She said, "You should all come down." Marisol grabbed her arm. "Me too." Diane looked at her daughter's face, at the hand on her arm, small and certain. She thought about the warm lock. She thought about the library book with the girl and the lighthouse door, read 3 times because the library was free and the book was good. She thought about crackers rationed in the back seat of a Civic with a failing alternator, and the folded motel notice in her coat pocket, and the manila envelope with the county deed, and all the distance between those things and this moment. "You stay with me," Diane said. "You hold my hand the whole way down." Marisol took her hand. They went down together. Marisol held her hand exactly as she had been told to. She did not run ahead. She did not let go. She tested each step the way Diane did, placing her foot and feeling for solid stone before she committed her weight, moving with the care of someone who understood without being told that this place required that kind of respect. Her headlamp, which Paul had fitted for her at the door, threw its circle of light down the passage ahead of them, overlapping with Diane's, doubling the illumination. The marks on the walls stopped Marisol twice. She pressed close to the stone to look at them, her finger tracing the air an inch from the surface without touching. "Are these letters?" she asked. "Some of them," Diane said. "What language?" Diane looked at the nearest symbol, the clean, deliberate cut of it, the depth of the stroke. She did not know. "Dr. Marsh will tell us." Marisol moved on. The chamber opened in front of them the same way it had opened in front of Diane 20 minutes before. The vault of the ceiling, the dressed stone floor, the warmth that came up through it. Marisol stepped through the threshold and stopped. She stood there with her headlamp moving across the room in the same slow arc Diane's had made, and she did not speak. The others came through behind them, and then they were all standing in the chamber together, and for a moment no one spoke at all. What they were looking at required a moment to understand, because its full meaning could not be taken in all at once. It had to be approached in pieces, item by item, section by section, the way you read a long document rather than the way you look at a photograph. The eye went first to the nearest objects, then the middle distance, then the back wall, and at each stage the understanding deepened and widened and became something harder to hold in a single thought. Along the left wall, in a row that ran the full length of the chamber, were crates. Wooden crates, the kind made in the second half of the 19th century for transport over long distances, constructed with the understanding that what was inside them needed to survive rough handling and rough conditions. Some of them had been opened. The lids leaned against the wall beside them. each lid numbered in a black paint that had faded but held. The open crates showed their contents without ambiguity. Coin. Not loose coin, but organized coin. The kind that had been placed by people who knew exactly what they had and wanted to be sure of the count. Gold coin, copper coin, silver coin, the currencies of a period before. The currencies Diane had grown up with, the faces on them belonging to presidents and figures she could not immediately name, but who had the bearing of the official and the permanent. Along the right wall, a different arrangement. Cases of a different construction, metal-banded, fitted with hardware that spoke of security rather than transport. These were not all closed. Several had their lids standing open and inside them, nested in material that had once been packing cloth and had over the decades compressed and partially degraded, but had maintained its protective purpose, were objects that Dr. Marsh was already moving toward with the focused urgency of someone who has spent a professional lifetime preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Objects of metal, objects of stone, objects that Diane's eye identified first as decorative and then, as her light held on them longer, as something more intentional than decoration, functional objects whose function she did not have the vocabulary to name, but whose quality was apparent in the craftsmanship, in the weight that was visible even from a distance, in the care that had been taken in their making. Down the center of the room, in the third and most unexpected arrangement, were the things that made Greta go completely still. They were machines. Not large machines, not the scale of the foundry equipment overhead, but machines of a different order, instruments of measurement and transfer, devices built for the purpose of working with the geothermal resource that the floor of the chamber transmitted upward through the stone. There were wells, bored through the chamber floor at intervals of approximately 10 feet, each capped with a fitting of wrought iron that showed the same craftwork as the cases along the right wall. There were pipes, connecting the wells to a manifold along the back wall, a system of valves and gauges and transfer mechanisms that was not modern but was not primitive either. That was the work of people who had understood something about thermal energy and had built their understanding into metal and stone and left it here. Greta crouched at the nearest well cap. She put her hand on the iron fitting. She looked up at Diane. "This is a functional system," she said, very quietly. Or it was. With repair and modernization, this could be. She stopped. She stood up. She looked at the room as a whole, at the coin crates and the artifact cases and the thermal infrastructure and the vaulted ceiling, at the sum of what someone had made here and left here. Her voice when she spoke was the most controlled Diane had ever heard it. "The geothermal resource accessed by these wells," she said, "based on what I've been reading for 2 weeks and what I'm seeing right now, is of a grade and scale that I would classify as commercially exceptional." She chose each word with a precision that made each word feel weighed before it was spoken. "If these wells are connected to the formation I believe they are connected to, the value of this resource, developed using current technology, is not a number I can give you standing here in this room." She looked at Diane directly. "But I can tell you that the thermal energy alone, without accounting for anything else in this room, places this property in a category that changes everything about what you own." Diane stood in the center of the chamber and felt the warmth coming up through the stone under her boots. Marisol had let go of her hand at some point in the last few minutes without Diane noticing when. She was standing at the row of open crates, looking at the coin inside the nearest one, not touching, just looking, her headlamp trained on it with the focused attention of someone who wants to understand something before they say a word about it. She turned around. "Mama. Yeah, this is old. Yes. Really old. Yes. How much is all this?" Diane looked at the room, at the crates and the cases and the wells and the manifold and the vaulted ceiling, at the walls with their cut marks and symbols, at the work of people she could not name who had been here before her and had trusted the ground to keep what they had placed in it. "I don't know yet," she said. Marisol looked back at the crates. She was quiet for a moment, but a lot. It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a child who has been patient and careful and precise about not wanting more than the truth, and who now has enough of the truth to close the gap between what they hoped and what was real. "Yes, baby. A lot." Marisol turned fully around and looked at her mother. Her headlamp hit Diane straight in the face, and Diane squinted against it, and Marisol said, "Sorry," and tilted the lamp down. And for a moment, they were just two people standing in a stone room 40 meters underground with the warmth coming up through the floor, looking at each other. We're not going back to the motel, Marisol said. Not permanently. Marisol nodded. Okay. She turned back to the crates. After a moment, she said, "Can I touch one?" Diane looked at Dr. Marsh. Dr. Marsh, who had been kneeling at one of the open artifact cases with her loupe and her notepad, stood and came over. She looked at the nearest open crate, and then at Marisol, and then at Diane. "Not the coins," she said. But she went to the wall and found a closed crate, and looked at the exterior, and then looked at the lid. She took a small tool from her case and worked the lid carefully, making no sound she didn't have to make, until it came free. She set it down and stepped back. Inside the crate, wrapped in the same degraded packing cloth, were books. Not books in the way that word usually registered. Not the library books Marisol had been reading and rereading in the motel room. These were bound manuscripts, heavy and dark with age, their covers made from materials Diane could not identify, their spines thick with the density of handmade pages. They had been packed with the same care as everything else in this room, placed in an order, each one nested against the next, arranged to last. Dr. Marsh looked at the top one. She did not touch it. She looked at the cover for a long time with her loupe, and then she looked up with an expression Diane had not yet seen on her face, which was an expression of someone trying to stay inside what they know and finding the walls of what they know insufficient. "I need to photograph all of this," she said. "I need to catalog all of this." She looked at Diane. "I need to contact the university. I need to contact several universities." She paused. "I need to contact people I have not spoken to in 20 years because I have never had occasion to, and now I do." "How long will all of that take?" Diane asked. Dr. Marsh looked at the room, at everything in it. "The first wave," she said slowly, 3 weeks. "The full assessment." She shook her head slightly. "We may be here for years." Diane stood in the warm chamber with her daughter beside her and her team around her, and the work of generations under her feet and in front of her and along the walls, and she thought about years with a feeling she had not felt in so long that she had to work to name it. It was not relief. Relief was what you felt when a threat passed. This was different. This was the feeling of a door opening that you had not known was closed. The feeling of a future that had been sealed off for reasons you had not fully understood suddenly becoming available, not as a gift, but as a consequence, as the thing that follows when you stand your ground and notice the warmth and don't let anyone tell you the ground isn't worth standing on. They stayed in the chamber for 3 hours. Curtis recorded everything his instruments could measure. Paul documented the structural conditions of the passage and the chamber with the thoroughness of someone who understood that they were in a place that had never been properly documented and might never be in this condition again. Sandra took her own samples from the chamber floor and the well caps, materials that would tell her things about the thermal system's history and its present state. Dr. Marsh photographed and noted and whispered to herself and occasionally stopped and stood very still, which was, Diane had come to understand, what she did when she was working something through that she did not yet have language for. Greta stayed close to the well manifold. She took measurements and made calls on her phone, moving to the base of the passage where the signal was marginally better, speaking in the clipped technical shorthand of someone reporting field observations to someone who knew how to hear them. Marisol stayed close to Diane. When they finally climbed back up and came through the steel door into the main floor, the afternoon light was different from the morning light, lower and more amber, and the building looked different to Diane, as buildings do when you have seen what is underneath them. She stood at the gate with Marisol beside her while the team packed their equipment into the trucks. Greta came to stand with her. "This is going to become known," Greta said. "You understand that. Not immediately, not today, but the moment any of this begins to move forward, the moment we start the formal geothermal assessment, the moment Dr. Marsh files her preliminary findings, this becomes part of a record that other people will see. I know. There will be people who try to claim a piece of this. People who say the county should have assessed it differently, that the auction was improper, that there are grounds to challenge your ownership." She looked at Diane steadily. "There will be people with more resources than you who will believe that resources entitles them to what you have." Diane looked at the foundry, at the rust and the weeds and the collapsed secondary building and the windows that had been dark and boarded for 30 years. "The deed is in my name," she said. "That's your foundation. You need to build on it fast. A lawyer who knows property law and mineral rights. A financial advisor who has worked with found asset cases." She paused. "And you need to call Beverly Hart back. Diane turned to look at her. Beverly Hart called me last week, Greta said. She wanted to know if I had looked at the Caldwell property. I told her I had. She said to tell you she was ready when you were. Diane thought about Beverly, about the 40-minute call, and the I will make some calls of my own. She nodded. She looked at Marisol, who was standing a few feet away looking back at the building with the expression of someone who has seen something that has changed the scale of what they think is possible and is quietly reorganizing their understanding of the world around the new scale. Mama, Marisol said without turning. Yeah, what are we going to do first? Diane thought about the question. She thought about the lawyer and the financial advisor and Beverly Hart and the geothermal assessment and Dr. Marsh's 3 weeks and the years of work ahead and the people who would come and the fight that would come with them and all the distance between this afternoon and anything that could be called resolved. She thought about Renata, who was coming for Christmas. She thought about Vasil, who had given them a room with better light and asked nothing for it. She thought about the library book read 3 times and the alternator that was still dying and the crackers that were still being rationed. She thought about $250 and the warm lock and the steps cut from living stone by hands she would never know, going down into the earth towards something that had been waiting to be found. First, she said, we call your aunt. Marisol turned around. And then we go eat something that isn't crackers. The smallest thing in the world crossed Marisol's face. Not a laugh, something that became a laugh a moment later, quiet and real, the laugh of a child who has been holding a lot and feels some of it release. She took her mother's hand. They walked to the car together in the amber late light, and behind them the foundry sat at the end of Breckenridge Road in the long shadow of the afternoon, the rust and the weeds and the sealed windows unchanged from any other day, looking to anyone who passed by exactly as worthless as it had always looked. The lock on the gate was still warm. Diane sat with her hand on it for a moment before she got in the car. She did not know why she did that. She had touched it dozens of times now, had pressed her palm against it in every kind of light and every kind of weather the past few weeks had brought. It was not a ritual. Or if it was a ritual, it was not one she had consciously chosen, but one that had accreted around the fact of the warmth, around the strangeness of a piece of iron radiating heat in the cold air of a road that went nowhere, around the way that strangeness had been the beginning of everything. She held the lock in her palm for a moment and felt the warmth, and then she let go and got in the car. Renata answered on the first ring, because Renata always answered on the first ring for Diane now, in the weeks since the call that had broken 14 months of silence. She had been waiting for news. She had not said so, had been careful not to apply pressure, but Diane could hear it in the speed of the pickup, in the particular quality of the silence before she spoke. We went down, Diane said. And Diane looked at Marisol in the passenger seat. Marisol was looking straight ahead through the windshield with both hands folded in her lap, the expression of someone waiting to hear their own life described. And it's real, Diane said. All of it. The silence on Renata's end lasted 4 seconds, which was a long time for Renata. How real? Diane thought about the chamber. The crates along the left wall. The artifact cases along the right. The wells in the floor and the manifold at the back and the vaulted ceiling and the warmth coming up through the stone. She thought about Greta's face and Dr. Marsh's face and the word exceptional said in a voice being held very carefully inside the limits of what could be responsibly stated. Real enough, she said, that Dr. Marsh needs to call universities. Real enough that Greta needs to file a formal geothermal assessment. Real enough that we need a lawyer by Monday. Monday. Another silence, shorter. Diane could hear the sound of Renata's house in the background, the particular ambient noise of a family home, children somewhere, the television, the ordinary machinery of a life that had been running continuously while Diane's had been suspended. Thomas knows a property attorney, Renata said. He's done work with him before. Good man. I'll call tonight. Okay. Diane. Yeah. You need to come here. You and Mari. You need to sleep somewhere that isn't a motel room, just for a few days, just while this gets organized. Come this weekend. Diane looked at the foundry in the rearview mirror as she pulled away from the gate, shrinking as the distance grew, the rust and the weeds and the dark windows, looking exactly like nothing. Okay, she said. We'll come Friday. Good. I'll tell the kids. Renata. Yeah. Thank you. For believing me before there was anything to believe. The sound on the other end was something between a laugh and something else, something that didn't have a simple name. You called me, Renata said. That was the hard part. Everything after that was easy. Diane drove down Breckenridge Road and turned onto the main road, and the foundry disappeared behind the tree line, and Marisol unfolded her hands and looked out the passenger window at the fields going past in the late light. They drove for a while without speaking. Then Marisol said, "Where are we eating?" Diane thought about what was in her wallet. She thought about the check she had written at the auction and the money Renata had sent and what remained. She thought about the chamber 40 meters below the ground they had just left, about the assessed value of that land being wrong by a number a careful scientist had declined to give standing in the room. "Wherever you want," she said. Marisol considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "Somewhere with hot food," she said. "Something that takes more than a microwave." Diane turned onto the main road toward town. "Yeah, that sounds about right." The sun was almost down. The sky above the tree line was the color of embers, deep orange shading to a dark red at the horizon, and in the last light the fields on either side of the road were gold and still, and the road ran on ahead of them into an evening that for the first time in a very long time felt like it was going somewhere specific rather than simply continuing. Thomas's attorney was a man named Gerald Foss who had been practicing property law in the county for 31 years, and who had the particular manner of someone who had seen enough to be unsurprised by most things, but had retained, underneath the professional composure, a genuine curiosity about the world. He came to the foundry on a Monday morning with a briefcase and a legal pad, and he spent 4 hours reading every document Diane had accumulated and walking every inch of the property and asking questions in a voice that never rose and never rushed. At the end of the 4 hours, he sat with Diane on a pair of folding chairs in the main poor floor, and he told her what she owned. The deed was clean, he said. The auction had been properly conducted. The county's authority to sell was unambiguous. Her title was as solid as title got in his experience, which was considerable. The mineral rights, he said, were attached to the surface deed under the terms of the original county disposition, which meant she owned what was under the ground as well as what was on top of it. This was not always the case with tax delinquency sales. In this case it was. The person who had drawn up the auction terms had not thought to separate them because no one had believed there was anything under this ground worth separating. The artifacts and historical materials in the chamber, he said, were a more complex question, one that would require coordination with the State Historical Society and potentially with federal agencies depending on the age and provenance of the materials. But that complexity did not in any way threaten her ownership of the property or the geothermal resource. Those were hers. The artifacts were a conversation to be had, not a challenge to be feared. He closed his legal pad and looked at her. "The people who will come," he said, "and they will come, will look for a seam. Some technical deficiency in the auction process, some ambiguity in the deed language, some argument about whether the mineral rights truly attach." He paused. "I have read this documentation 3 times this morning. There is no seam. You did everything right." Diane thought about what right had looked like. The motel table at 4 in the morning. The call to Renata. The envelope she had opened after carrying it for 11 days. $250. "What do I do now?" she asked. Gerald Foss set his legal pad in his briefcase. "Now," he said, "you let the assessments complete. You let Greta file her report. You let Dr. Marsh finish her preliminary catalog. You let Robert Lees finalize the remediation estimate. And then you sit down with Beverly Hart and you decide what you want this to become." "What it becomes," Diane said. He looked at her evenly. "A property with a commercially exceptional geothermal resource, an historically significant subsurface archive, and a remediation profile that is a fraction of what the county believed." He paused. "What that becomes depends entirely on what you want." She had not allowed herself to think about that yet. She had been so focused on establishing the reality of what was there, on building the documentary foundation that Gerald Foss had just told her was solid, that she had not stood back far enough to see what the thing actually was, what it could be. She thought about it now. Beverly Hart came the following week. She drove herself, no assistant, no entourage, just Beverly in a sensible car with a file folder on the passenger seat, and the focused attention she brought to everything she decided was worth her time. She had been running the Regional Industrial Development Company for 8 years, and before that she had spent 12 years doing project finance for infrastructure projects across the upper Midwest, and she had the kind of knowledge that comes from watching a lot of things succeed and a lot of things fail, and understanding clearly the difference between the two. She walked the property. She went down the passage with Diane, standing in the chamber for a long time without speaking, looking at everything with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory. She read Greta's preliminary findings, which had come in 2 days earlier, sitting at the folding table in the main poor floor with the document held in both hands, and her eyes moving through it without hurry. When she set it down, she looked at Diane. "You understand what this says?" "I understand what it means in general terms," Diane said. "I need someone to translate the specific numbers." Beverly looked at the document. "The formation Greta has identified," she said, "is a high-enthalpy geothermal resource. That classification puts it in the top tier of commercially viable geothermal sites in the continental United States. There are perhaps 12 sites of this grade currently in operation or development." She paused. "The thermal output potential, based on Greta's gradient measurements and depth modeling, is sufficient to support a generation facility that would produce power at a scale relevant to regional grid supply." "What does that mean in dollar terms?" Beverly looked at her steadily. "A fully developed geothermal generation facility on a resource of this grade," she said, "produces revenue over a 30-year project life in the range of $300 to $500 million. Before you factor in the land value, the remediation uplift, or the historical materials." Diane sat with that number for a moment. "The artifacts," Beverly continued, "are a separate conversation. Dr. Marsh's preliminary catalog, which I also read, identifies materials that she believes, pending full authentication, include pre-Civil War currency collections, significant quantities of gold and silver coin, and historical documents and objects of a provenance she describes as potentially major." She was careful with the word potentially, but she was not careful with the word major. Greta had said the assessed value was wrong by a number she was not qualified to give. Dr. Marsh had said she needed to call people she had not spoken to in 20 years. Beverly was saying $300 to $500 million over 30 years before you factored anything else in. Diane thought about $250. The number on the county envelope. The opening bid that no one else had wanted to meet. The price of a piece of ground that everyone who looked at it had decided was a liability. She thought about the man in the canvas jacket at the auction, who had looked at the environmental record and run his numbers, and stopped at $1,800. She thought about the woman with the reading glasses who had stopped at $1,500 and then closed her paddle and watched. She thought about what it had cost them not to notice the warmth. "There are going to be challenges," Beverly said. "Not to your title, not if Gerald is as certain as you say he is. But there will be people who feel that what you have should belong to someone else. To a larger company, to a development group, to some entity with the scale to do what needs to be done here. They will make arguments. Some of them will have lawyers, and some of them will have political connections, and some of them will have the specific variety of confidence that comes from never having had to fight for anything." "I know," Diane said. Beverly looked at her. And the deed is in my name." Beverly nodded. Then she said, "I want to be part of this. Not as a favor. As a partner. I have the project finance background to structure this correctly. I have the relationships with the energy sector that will be necessary to bring in development capital without losing control of the asset." She paused. "You need someone who has done this before." Diane looked at this woman she had worked for 8 years ago, who had kept her in her memory all this time without being asked to, who had made calls before Diane had anything to justify calls being made. "What do you want in return?" Beverly named a percentage. It was not small. It was also not unreasonable given what she was offering. Diane thought about it. "Okay," she said. Beverly picked up her file folder. "Then let's get to work." Renata came for Christmas as she had promised, with Thomas and their 3 children, and she came 3 days early because when Diane had described the situation in full on the phone 2 weeks before, Renata had gone quiet in the specific way she went quiet when she was reorganizing her understanding of something she had thought she already understood, and then she had said, "We're coming the 22nd, not the 25th. And Diane had said okay. They stayed in the motel. Basile gave them 2 adjacent rooms and refused to charge for the second one, and when Renata tried to press money on him, he shook his head with the undemonstrative generosity that Diane had come to understand was simply his character, not a performance of it. On the 23rd, Diane took all of them to the foundry. Renata stood at the gate and looked at the building for a long moment before she said anything. Thomas stood beside her with his hands in his coat pockets. Their 3 children, who were 11, 9, and 7, stood in a row behind them and looked at the rust and the weeds with the frank assessment of children who have not yet learned to pretend that things look better than they do. "It looks terrible," the 11-year-old said. "Marcus," Renata said. "No," Diane said, "he's right. It does." She looked at the building. "From out here it does." She unlocked the gate. She took them down the passage with the portable lights the team had left rigged, and she watched her sister's face in the light of the chamber, watched Renata's expression move through the stages that everyone's expression moved through in that room. The initial incomprehension, the gradual recognition, the moment when the recognition became something larger and less manageable. Thomas stood at the well manifold and looked at the iron fittings with the eye of a plumber who understands pipe systems and can read the intention of a design from its hardware. He did not say anything for a long time. When he spoke, he said, "Whoever built this knew what they were doing." "Yes," Diane said. He crouched at the nearest well cap and touched the iron fitting the way Greta had touched it. He held his hand there. "It's warm all the way down," he said. "All the way down." Renata had gone to the crates. She stood in front of the open one, looking at the coin with her arms crossed and her chin slightly raised, which was what she did when she was holding her face still because what was behind it was too large for the occasion. She turned around. "Diane." "Yeah, 14 months, Renata said. "You carried 14 months of this alone." "Not exactly." Diane looked at her. "I wasn't carrying this. I was carrying other things. This was just the thing at the end of it." Renata's jaw worked slightly. She was a woman who did not cry easily and was not about to start in a stone room in front of her children. "You called me when you needed me," she said. "You answered." The silence between them had the particular texture of a silence between two people who have said the important thing and are now deciding whether anything else is necessary. Nothing else was necessary. Renata looked at the room one more time. Then she turned around and said, "Okay," and that was that. They climbed back out and drove to the diner that Marisol had wanted to go to on the night of the discovery, the one with hot food and tables instead of a microwave. And they ate dinner together in the amber light of the place, and the children compared notes on who had liked the underground chamber most, and who had been most frightened by it, and Thomas said he would come back with proper pipe fittings if Diane needed someone to assess the manifold condition, and Renata sat beside Diane and did not say much, but kept her hand on Diane's forearm the way she had since they were children when one of them needed to be reminded the other was there. Marisol sat across the table from her cousins and talked with the ease of someone who had been isolated long enough that easy conversation felt like something she had earned. She talked about the passage and the marks on the walls and the manuscripts and the warmth and all of it without embellishment, because the thing itself was already beyond embellishment, and watching her talk, watching her daughter tell the story of the past weeks with the clarity and precision she brought to things she cared about, Diane felt something that she had been afraid to feel until now because feeling it fully had seemed like a kind of presumption, a claiming of something before it was confirmed. She felt it now. It was not triumph. Triumph was about other people losing. This was something that had nothing to do with other people at all. It was the specific satisfaction of having been right when the cost of being wrong would have been everything, of having trusted something you could not fully explain, the warmth of a lock in cold air, the shape of a decision at 4 a.m. with a county envelope on the table and a child asleep in the next bed, and having that trust turn out to be the most accurate thing you had ever done. The formal geothermal assessment was filed in February. Greta's report ran to 90 pages and contained language that caused 3 separate energy companies to reach out to Beverly Hart within 2 weeks of its filing in the public record. Beverly handled all of them the same way, with the composed competence of someone who has been doing this long enough to know that urgency on the other side of the table is information about value. She called Diane after each contact. She described the conversations in precise terms. She did not tell Diane what to want. She laid out the options and the implications and the trade-offs, and she let Diane decide. The first option was a full sale of the geothermal development rights to one of the major energy companies. Clean, immediate, a number with many zeros that would end the financial precarity of Diane's life in a single transaction. The second option was a development partnership in which Diane retained a percentage stake in the project and received both an upfront payment and ongoing revenue sharing over the project life. The third option was slower and harder, a structure in which Diane retained majority ownership and brought in development capital against the asset value, building the project incrementally, with Beverly managing the finance. Beverly laid out each option without editorializing. Diane listened. She thought about the men who had cut those steps. She thought about the person in 1963 who had found the door and gone down and come back up and built a wall and walked away. She thought about what it meant to hold something and what it meant to give it away and what the difference was between selling and surrendering. She took the second option. Beverly negotiated the terms over 6 weeks. The lead energy company was a regional firm with a track record in geothermal development and enough institutional patience to work with a structure that was not the clean acquisition they had initially wanted. They were not happy with the retained stake. They were less unhappy with it than they had expected to be, because Beverly was a skilled negotiator and because the resource was exceptional enough that walking away was not something any of them actually wanted to do. The agreement was signed on a Tuesday morning in Gerald Foss's office, Diane on one side of the table and 3 people from the energy company on the other, and Beverly beside Diane with the file folder she always carried and the composed attention she brought to everything that mattered. Diane signed her name 11 times. When it was done, the lead representative from the energy company, a man named Daniel Cruz who had the practiced pleasantness of someone who spent his professional life across negotiating tables, offered his hand. "We'll make something good here," he said. Diane shook his hand. "Yes," she said. "We will." She did not say, "I know what you offered first." She did not say, "I know what you would have paid for this if my title had been in question." She did not say any of the things that were technically available to say in that moment, because saying them would have made the moment smaller than it was. She just shook his hand and let the silence carry what it needed to carry. The upfront payment cleared Diane's account on a Thursday. She sat at the kitchen table of the apartment she and Marisol had moved into 3 weeks earlier, a real apartment with a real lease in her name, with 2 bedrooms and windows that looked out over a street with trees, and she looked at the number on the bank's transfer confirmation and let it be real. She called Renata. Renata answered on the first ring. "It cleared," Diane said. Renata said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "How much?" Diane told her. Another silence. "Diane," Renata said. "I know. That's..." She stopped. "That's a lot of money." "I know. What are you going to do?" Diane looked out the window at the street with the trees. There were things she had decided already and things she was still deciding. Some of them she said now, and some of them she kept for the right moment. "I'm going to pay you and Thomas back first." Renata started to say something. "Don't," Diane said. "It's not a discussion. You believed me before there was anything to believe in. That gets paid back with actual money, and also with something else I haven't figured out how to say yet." A sound on the other end. Renata's equivalent of tears. "I'm going to set up an education account for Marisol," Diane said. "A real one. She can go anywhere she wants to go." "Okay. And then I'm going to figure out the rest." "Okay." Renata paused. "Are you happy?" Diane thought about the question. It was not a simple question. "I'm okay," she said. "I think happy comes after okay. I've been not okay for a while. So I'm starting with okay, and we'll see where it goes." "That sounds right." They stayed on the phone for a while after that, not talking about money or the foundry or the chamber or any of it, just talking the way they had talked when they were young, in the casual, unstructured way of people who have so much shared history that conversation doesn't need a destination to be worthwhile. Dr. Marsh's preliminary findings were published in the spring in a journal Diane had never heard of, but which, Gerald told her, was read by every relevant person in the relevant fields. The findings described the chamber and its contents in the careful, measured language of scholarship, establishing provenance and historical context, and the significance of what had been preserved there. The manuscripts were from the mid-19th century. The coin collection was among the largest privately documented accumulations of pre-Civil War American currency known to exist. The artifact collection included objects whose origin Dr. Marsh described as consistent with a network of individuals engaged in the protection and transport of assets during the period of significant social disruption in the 1850s and 1860s, which was the scholarly way of saying what Diane had understood since she stood in that chamber the first time and thought about what had needed protecting in the second half of the 19th century and who had protected it. The Historical Society became involved. The federal agencies became involved. There were conversations about public access and preservation and the proper stewardship of objects of this significance. These were not simple conversations. Diane sat in a great many rooms with a great many people and listened and asked questions and did not let anyone rush her toward conclusions she had not reached herself. Gerald sat beside her at most of these meetings, and when she looked at him sometimes he would give the smallest nod, which meant, "This is going well," and sometimes he would give nothing, which meant, "Pay close attention." The outcome of these conversations was a structure that Diane and Gerald had proposed at the outset and that had taken 5 months to negotiate into something everyone could sign. A historical trust, established with Diane as a founding trustee, would take custodianship of the chamber and its contents. The trust would work with the State Historical Society and with Dr. Marsh's University on preservation and research. Public access would eventually be established, carefully, over a period of years, because the chamber required stabilization before it could receive visitors, and because the objects in it required years of proper archival work before they could be exhibited. Diane would remain a trustee. She would be part of every significant decision made about the site for as long as she chose to be. She had been careful about that. She had been careful about a great many things. Gerald had told her once, in one of the quieter moments of the long process, that she negotiated like someone who had thought about the long term before she thought about the immediate, which he had meant as a compliment and which she had accepted as one. She had thought about the long term. She had thought about Marisol, who was 10 now and who had been following all of this with the patient comprehension of someone who understood more than she was given credit for and chose to understand rather than demand. She had thought about the people who had built the chamber, who had thought about time in increments that dwarfed any individual life, who had built in stone because stone lasted and arranged what they had in a system because systems could be read by people who came after. She had thought about what she owed to that way of thinking. She thought she owed it the same consideration in return. Vasil came to see the foundry in the early spring, when the remediation work was beginning and the corrugated walls had been painted and the weeds cleared from the concrete apron and the collapsed secondary structure removed, and the whole site had begun to look like what it was becoming rather than what it had been. He stood at the gate where Diane had stood on that first morning with Marisol, looking at the building with the receptive attention he brought to most things, and he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You knew? I didn't know. I thought. That is sometimes the same thing." She looked at him. She had come to understand, over the months she had lived at his motel, that Vasil had the specific wisdom of someone who had built something in a country that was not his own and had learned in the process that building required a kind of attention most people reserved for crisis rather than ordinary life. "You were very good to us," she said. "You were easy to be good to." He looked at her. "Both of you." She had written him a check the week after the transfer cleared. He had accepted it with the same undramatic dignity he brought to everything, folded it once, put it in his shirt pocket, and said, "Thank you, Diane," in the tone of someone who meant it without needing to perform it. Now he looked at the building and said, "What has it become? A power facility eventually, and a historical site, both at once somehow. That is a strange combination. Most true things are strange when you say them out loud." He nodded slowly. He looked at the gate, at the lock that had been replaced with a new one when Diane had rekeyed the property, a new lock that was the same industrial weight as the old one. She had kept the old padlock. It sat on the windowsill of the apartment, on the sill where she could see it from the kitchen table, and sometimes in the morning when the light hit it she would look at it and think about the first morning, the cold air and the 43 degrees and a 9-year-old's hand pressed flat against the iron. Vasil touched the new lock with 2 fingers. "Still warm," he said. "Still warm." He stepped back. He looked at the foundry one more time. "Good," he said, and that was all, and it was enough. Marisol's birthday fell in late April, and Diane had been thinking about what to give her since January. She had thought about the education account, which was real and funded and would matter more than any object could. She had thought about books, because Marisol still loved books with the specific loyalty she gave to things that had been honest with her when everything else was uncertain. She had thought about the yellow dress and the daisies from the inspiration story and what it meant to give a child something that said, "You are seen, you are particular, you exist specifically and not in general." What she gave Marisol was a key. It was the old iron key from the county clerk, the one that had opened the foundry gate on the morning of the auction. She had asked Gerald whether she could keep it, explaining what she wanted it to mean, and Gerald had checked with the county, and the county had said it was hers. It was always hers. It had been part of the deed transfer. She gave it to Marisol in a small wooden box at the kitchen table in the apartment with the trees outside the window. Marisol opened the box and looked at the key and then looked at her mother. "This is the key," she said. "The original one." "Yes." Marisol picked it up. She held it the same way she had held the padlock in that first morning, with both hands, feeling the weight of it. "This is the one you used to open the gate." "Yes." "On auction day." "Yes." Marisol was quiet. She held the key, and she thought about something. Diane could see the thinking happening in the specific way Marisol's thinking was always visible, in a slight focus of the eyes and a stillness of the rest of her face. "Mama." "Yeah, we noticed the warm lock. That's what started it. That's what started it. But you noticed the survey first. The 1986 survey that mentioned the thermal anomaly. You read that before we ever went there." Diane looked at her daughter. "Yes. And you figured out what it meant." "I thought I did." Marisol looked at the key. "You didn't need the lock to find this. You would have found it anyway from the survey." "Maybe," Diane said, "but I wouldn't have believed it the same way." She paused. "You telling me the lock was warm. Your hand on that iron. That made it real to me before I had anything else to make it real." She looked at her daughter. "You were the proof I needed." Marisol considered this. "Then we both found it." "Yes, we both found it." Marisol closed both hands around the key. She held it like that for a moment, and the morning light came through the window and hit the iron, and the old metal caught the light the way warm things do, giving it back with a slightly different color than it arrived. "Okay," Marisol said. She put the key in her pocket, her own pocket, and she left it there, and later that day Diane saw her touch the pocket from the outside once, just to confirm the weight of it was still there, and then she went back to whatever she was reading. In June, the remediation work completed on schedule, under budget. Robert Lee's standing at the gate on the last day with the kind of satisfaction of someone who has done something well and knows it and doesn't need to make anything of it beyond the fact of its being done. In August, the development agreement moved into its active phase, and the energy company brought in its engineering team, and the site began its long transformation toward what it was going to become. In September, Dr. Marsh published her second paper, the fuller one, the one with the complete preliminary catalog and the historical analysis and the provenance documentation that caused the phone in Gerald Foss's office to ring for 3 weeks straight. The calls were from scholars and institutions and some journalists, and some people who simply wanted to see the chamber, which was not yet possible, and Gerald handled them all with the patience of a man who has been answering phones for 31 years and knows that patience is most of the work. Diane was not in Gerald's office when those calls came in. She was at the Foundry most days, not because there was always something urgent to do, but because it was hers, and she wanted to know it in all its seasons and conditions, wanted to know how it looked in morning fog and afternoon sun and the flat gray light of a cloudy day, wanted to know the sounds it made as it changed. She was there on a Wednesday morning in September when a car she didn't recognize pulled up to the gate. A woman got out, somewhere in her 60s, wearing a coat that was good quality but not conspicuous, carrying nothing except car keys. She stood at the gate and looked at the building for a long time, and then she looked at Diane. "I heard about this place," she said. "I read Dr. Marsh's paper." Diane looked at her. "This happens sometimes now." People came. The site was not yet open to the public, but people came anyway, drawn by the paper or by the word that had spread in the specific way that unusual things spread, person to person, accumulating weight as it moved. "It's not open for visitors yet," Diane said. "I know." The woman paused. "My grandfather worked here, in the 50s and into the 60s. He was a foreman on the poor floor." Diane looked at her. "He talked about this place until he died," the woman said. "He talked about something he found here, something underground. He never told anyone what it was. We thought he'd invented it, the way old men sometimes do, filling in the spaces memory leaves." She looked at the building. "He hadn't invented it." "No," Diane said. "He hadn't." They stood at the gate for a moment. "Did he go down?" Diane asked. "In 1963, when they made the modification. Did he go down?" The woman looked at her. "Yes. He told me that much. He went down, and he saw what was there, and he came back up, and he built the wall, and he never told anyone." Diane thought about that. About a man who had found something extraordinary and had chosen to leave it rather than take it, who had built the wall not to conceal it forever, but to protect it, who had left the door without a lock so that someone else could find it when the time was right. She thought about what it cost to walk away from something like that. The daily cost of it, for the rest of his life. The carrying of a knowledge that had nowhere to go. Why didn't he tell anyone? She said. The woman was quiet for a moment. He said he didn't think it was his to tell. He said someone had put it there for safekeeping, and he didn't have the right to decide when the keeping was over. Diane looked at the gate. At the new lock. He was right, she said. The woman nodded. They stood for a moment longer in the September morning. The two of them at the gate of the building that connected them across a long arc of time and decision and patience. And then the woman said, "Thank you," quietly, and got back in her car and drove away. Diane stood at the gate alone. She thought about the foreman. She thought about the people who had cut the steps and placed the crates and capped the wells and arranged everything in the specific order of people who are thinking about someone they will never meet. She thought about all the holding that had happened here, all the trust extended to the future by people who had no way of knowing whether the future would be equal to it. She pressed her hand flat against the gate. The lock was warm. She stood there for a while in the morning light with her hand on the iron, feeling the heat move through it from whatever depth the heat came from. The ancient, reliable geology of it. The thing that had been there before the foundry and would be there after everything she was building was gone, patient as stone, warm as anything. She thought about Marisol. She thought about the key in her daughter's pocket, the weight of it. She thought about an education account and an apartment with trees outside the window and a library book that no longer needed to be rationed. She thought about $250. Then she took her hand off the gate, and she went to work. The county commissioner's office sent a letter in October. Diane read it twice at the kitchen table with coffee going cold beside her. The letter was from the commissioner himself, a man named Aldrich who had held the office for 11 years and who had the formal manner of someone who chose every word aware that it might be quoted. It congratulated her on the development agreement and on the historical trust and on what the letter called an extraordinary discovery that reflects well on our community's heritage. It expressed the county's enthusiastic support for all future phases of the project. It did not mention the auction. It did not mention the assessed value of $250. It did not mention the environmental assessment that had described the property as a liability and set the opening bid accordingly. It did not mention the fact that the county had held this land for 2 years without a buyer and had been preparing to clear it from the books as a non-performing asset. Diane set the letter on the table and thought about all the things it did not say. She was not angry. She had moved past the version of this story in which anger was the primary color. She understood how assessments worked, how institutional knowledge accumulated and then calcified, how the people responsible for valuing things developed habits of looking that served them most of the time and failed them occasionally in ways that were not malfeasance, but were simply the cost of systematizing judgment. She understood it, and she did not excuse it, and she filed the letter in the folder Gerald kept for correspondence of this type, and she moved on. Gerald called the following week. A development company from Minneapolis had made inquiries, he said. They had read the geothermal assessment and the historical papers, and they wanted to discuss an acquisition of Diane's partnership stake. Diane listened. The number they were proposing, Gerald said, was significant. He said it in the way he said all numbers, without inflation and without minimization, just the number in the air. She thought about it. Not interested, she said. Gerald made a note. That's what I assumed. I wanted you to hear the number. I heard it. She was not interested in selling what she had spent everything she had to acquire. She was not interested in the transaction that converted the long, patient work of finding and holding into a number that someone else would benefit from for 30 years, while she received only what she had been willing to take in a single moment rather than over a lifetime. She had thought about this too, about what it meant to hold, about the foreman who had gone down those steps and come back up and spent the rest of his life not selling what he had found because he had understood it was not his to sell, about all the people in the long chain of holding that had preserved the chamber and its contents from the 1850s through to the morning Marisol had pressed her hand against a warm padlock in 43-degree air. She was the next one in the chain. She was not the last. She called Marisol at school during the lunch break, which she was allowed to do once a week if it was brief, and she told her about the offer from Minneapolis and what she had told Gerald. Marisol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. Just good. Just good," Marisol said. She paused. Also, Mrs. Hartwell said I could do my history project on the foundry. The Historical Trust sent our class some of the documents Dr. Marsh photographed. The ones that are safe to share with schools. That's great. She said it's a primary source. It is. Marisol was quiet again. Then she said, some of the kids in my class didn't know about it. About us finding it. I told them. What did they say? She considered. They said it was cool. She paused. One of them asked if we were rich now. What did you say? Marisol's answer came without hesitation. I said we found something that was worth finding. I said that's different from being rich. Diane stood at the apartment window with the phone against her ear and looked at the trees on the street, which were going orange and red now in the October light, shedding leaves in the small wind. That's exactly right, she said. I know, Marisol said, and went back to lunch. The first public event at the Foundry was a modest one, not a grand opening, not a ceremony with speeches and ribbons and officials wanting their photograph taken beside something they had nothing to do with creating. Diane had been deliberate about that. The event was a community information session held on the main pour floor of the building, which had been cleaned and lit and furnished with the minimum necessary to make it functional, and it was attended by whoever from the county wanted to come. About 60 people came. Diane stood at the front and talked about the property's history, about the 1986 survey and what she had read in it, about the auction and the remediation and the geothermal development agreement and the historical trust. She talked about the chamber and what was in it, using Dr. Marsh's language where precision mattered and her own language where the human part of the story needed to be told in human terms. She talked about the foreman who had gone down in 1963 and come back up and kept the secret for the rest of his life. She talked about the woman who had come to the gate in September. She talked about what it meant to hold something for the future. She did not talk about the motel. She did not talk about the crackers, or the alternator, or the notice folded in her coat pocket with 5 days written on it. Those things were hers and Marisol's, and they had earned the right to keep them private or share them on their own terms, and she had not yet decided which. When she finished talking, a man near the back raised his hand. He was in his 70s, wearing a canvas work coat, the kind of coat that had been washed many times. I drove past this property for 40 years, he said. Never thought it was anything. Diane looked at him. Most people didn't, she said. He nodded slowly. He looked around the room, at the clean floor and the lit walls and the steel door at the east end, visible from where they stood, its frame now properly documented and stabilized by Paul's team. What made you look? Diane thought about how to answer. She thought about the honest answer and the abbreviated answer and the version of the answer that contained everything and the version that contained enough. I read a survey, she said, and my daughter touched a warm lock. The man looked at her. That's all. That's all. He nodded again. He put his hands in his coat pockets and he looked at the floor and he said, well, and that was all he said. But it was the kind of well that meant something. That meant he understood the gap between what something looks like and what it is, and that he was perhaps reckoning with all the times he had passed this gate and not stopped, and what that meant about the things he had not noticed in other places on other roads. Diane understood. She was not without sympathy for it. After the session, Marisol helped her stack the folding chairs. They worked in the easy quiet of people who have worked together before, moving through the space without talking, until the room was returned to its functional state, and only the two of them remained. Marisol looked at the steel door. Can we go down? Diane looked at the door. The passage was now properly lit, the steps documented and reinforced where the engineering assessment had found softness, the air monitoring continuous. The chamber was being worked systematically by Dr. Marsh's team, who came 3 days a week and who had been at it for 6 months and expected to be at it for several years more. Not tonight, Diane said, but soon. Marisol accepted this. They walked out through the main door and across the concrete apron, which was clean now, the weeds gone, the surface repaired in several places where the freeze and thaw had cracked it badly. The evening had come down while they were inside, and the sky above the tree line was the deep blue of early dark, and the first stars were appearing, and the air was cold in the specific way of October evenings that carry the first real suggestion of winter. Diane locked the gate. She held the lock for a moment. The new lock, not the old one. The old one was on the windowsill at home, warm in the morning light. This one was warm too. Of course it was. The warmth did not come from the lock. It came from what was below the lock, from the formation that had been there before the foundry and before the people who had found it, and before any story that could be told about this piece of ground in any language that existed. The warmth was older than all of that. It would be there when all of that was gone. She let go of the lock. Marisol was waiting at the car. She had her hands in her coat pockets, and she was looking up at the stars with the open expression she had when she was not performing anything for anyone, when she was just herself in the world, looking at it. Diane walked over. Ready. Ready. They got in the car. Diane started the engine, which turned over on the first try, which was no longer remarkable because the Civic had a new alternator now, had had one since February, and the miracle of a reliable engine had already faded from consciousness into the taken for granted, which was its own kind of good news, the kind that meant something had been fixed well enough to be forgotten. She pulled away from the gate and drove down Breckenridge Road toward the main road, and in the rearview mirror the Foundry shrank and disappeared behind the curve and the trees, and ahead of them the road ran through the dark toward the apartment with the trees outside the window and the old padlock on the sill and everything else that was ordinary now and had not always been. Marisol had the key out. She was turning it in her hands in the passenger seat, the way she sometimes did, feeling the weight of the iron, the age of it. Mama. Yeah, when Dr. Marsh is done with the first phase. When they let people come see it. Visitors. Yeah, can I be the one who shows them the steps? Diane drove for a moment in the dark. Yes, she said. You can be the one who shows them the steps. Marisol put the key back in her pocket. Outside the window the fields went past in the headlights, the last of the year's grass flat and silver in the light, and above the fields the sky was full of stars going all the way to the horizon, and the road ran on ahead of them into the night. And it went somewhere now. It had always gone somewhere. They just had to be the ones to drive it. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.